Hello everyone, Platform Disciple here, and today we are doing an interesting video where I am showcasing 10 Sleepers of Avarrach cards I have designed. But before we get into that, little follow-up on the previous video about reaching out to the Infinity Wars team to potentially work with them. It sounds like, from what I've heard from Hacker and ES, that a lot of the stuff that I covered in the video that I said was very problematic is actually going to be, or they are trying to address sometime in the future, hopefully soon. And so they make it sound like the game is heading a very good direction from where it is now. So that is a relief. And in addition, on Facebook, I saw advertisements in my newsfeed for Infinity Wars, which is crazy and awesome. And the advertisements were targeting Hearthstone and Magic players, which is what they should be doing. So that's very good. But that being said, I'm still going to reach my neck out and try to get a job working with the Infinity Wars team because I still think I have a lot to offer. Like, for example, the advertisement, when you clicked on it, although there were a lot of things that were very good, like it featured the art from Infinity Wars and the factions, talked about them a little. It also had a grid which showcased what features Hearthstone, Magic, and Infinity Wars have and which ones they don't, just to compare and contrast them. Those things were very good, but it did also have that really obnoxious trailer that I mentioned in the previous video that has like very loud music, and then in addition, it has just it looks like it was edited by like a novice, like a high schooler who's taken a few video editing courses. It doesn't look professional is the point. And then there was also the video that Crestmore made a while ago that I talked about, that talked about Rebellion, or not Rebellion, Reborn, and at this point it's thoroughly outdated and doesn't look good on a page advertising the game. So actually after this video, I'm probably going to take my own shot at creating a advertisement video for Infinity Wars, as professional as I can with the software I have, because I only have a pretty basic video editing software. I don't have like Photoshop or anything like that. I can't, create something that looks flashy, but I can create something that is clean, concise, and conveys a much more meaningful message than showcasing the second feature they showcased in the video with the super loud music is the undo button, which is like, although the undo button is fantastic, don't get me wrong, that is a great feature, it is not the second feature you should talk about. It really isn't. Anyways, what are we doing today? We are looking at these sleeper cards I've designed, and the reason we are looking at them is because a very long time ago, Sleepers of Avarrach was planned to be rotated out of competitive play to make room for a new faction potentially, which makes a lot of sense if you look at Hearthstone and Magic's standards, which are standard is a format that uses only the newest cards to keep the overall power level a little lower, make sure the efficiency of decks doesn't get too extreme, and to make sure the card pool is small enough that newer players can join the game and feel like they can collect and build a reasonable deck. Whereas if it included every card, it might feel a little more daunting for newer players. But anyways, rotating the entire faction out is very extreme because so Hearthstone and Magic, when they rotate sets, but Magic's 5 colors stay and Hearthstone's 9 classes stay. So people who've dedicated themselves to a certain play style can still play that way. But if you rotated out something like Sleepers of Avarrach, there are some people who have spent a long time collecting Sleepers of Avarrach and are dedicated to that faction. Admittedly, I don't know like how many people that is, but like judging from the comments of my videos, there are people who have dedicated themselves to factions. I know I have a few Descendants of the Dragons fans in my subscriber pool, and I think they would probably be pretty upset if Descendants of the Dragons rotated out, and as you can imagine, there are probably people that feel the same way about Sleepers. I know that there was also potential that Sleepers would get rotated back in later, but it still does potentially alienate a group of the player base for a long time. To be clear, those players can still play with their Sleepers cards in casual, but it does make it sends a message that makes it feel like the game might not care as much about that player, which is a bad message to send. But anyways, that is something that was talked about a very long time ago, and I don't know what the Infinity Wars team has planned now. But what I do know is that a long time ago, the reason why Sleepers were selected to be rotated out as opposed to other factions was in part because the team at the time had felt that the Sleepers design space had been fully explored or was getting close to fully explored, meaning that they didn't feel that they could make new interesting Sleepers cards that still fit the themes for the faction. And this video is not only to entertain you with some interesting card designs and to showcase my ability to design cards in case the Infinity Wars team would like to work with me at some point, but it's also to showcase that the Sleepers do have a lot more design space available to them. And I want to quickly go over Sleepers as a faction very briefly because I recorded this already. And I spent way too much time talking about that. So let's hop into it. Sleepers of Avarrach is a faction that is a proactive faction, but very slow, which makes them very unique. So to explain proactive versus reactive, a proactive deck strategy is one that presents threats and makes plays, and the opponent is the one doing the responding. Flamed On is a very good example of that kind of gameplay. Warpath is a very good example. Genesis generally, and Sleepers as well. But what makes Sleepers interesting is that they're also very, very slow. So although they are proactive and they're the ones presenting the threats generally, the threat is a very, very long investment threat as opposed to a very fast, high immediacy threat. So like if you think about it, Flamed On, when they play a card, the threat that card presents, if we were to draw a graph over time, the threat that it presents immediately is very, very high, and then the threat tapers off as the game goes on because the threat level of Flamed On cards falls off because they are generally using low-cost characters and a lot of them. And when the game goes on long enough, low-cost characters are going to be weaker than high-cost characters, obviously. But Sleepers of Avarrach, on the other hand, early in the game, their threat level is very low because their characters are generally pretty weak. But as the game goes on, those characters are an investment, either because they slowly power up or because they come back eventually. The point is that the longer the game goes on, the more potential that the Sleepers have as their graveyard fills up or as their characters have been out for a long time. So we're trying to follow some of those themes. Also to keep in mind, the Sleepers mechanics, game mechanics, are graveyard themes, infect, and bloodthirst for the most part, in addition to undead tribal. So those are the four kind of main core themes. And we're actually going to do a couple things. One is we're trying to supplement the existing themes, but also try to push for a couple new themes. The one that I've pushed the most in this set of 10 cards is a Endless Horde theme, because Endless Horde is a very, very unique card that should you be able to build a deck around it, would be a very interesting deck. But right now, it costs 3 and has such a low immediate threat. Like when I talked about high threat versus low threat over time, right now Endless Horde presents such a low immediate threat, and it doesn't it doesn't ramp up to be a high threat for an extremely long time, to the point where it's generally speaking going to be best to just ignore that card. So we're trying to push that strategy a little bit more. And then in addition to that, we also want to address and keep in mind Sleeper's current weaknesses, which is that they still are a low threat early, high threat late. So high threat early factions like Flame Dawn and Overseers, particularly because Overseers has flyers, tend to beat this faction. Like I said, flyers are supposed to be a weakness. Having characters removed from your graveyard is supposed to be a weakness. So Overseers are the natural predator of Sleepers of Avarrach. But one weakness that I want to patch up is that currently Sleepers, because they produce so many characters, very frequently lose to morale, which there's nothing wrong with Sleepers losing to morale. But the problem is that I think Sleepers ought to fit in a place where they excel against the mill style decks that use Tibat or Acquire or Spontaneous Combustion or Yuan-Chi's Wrath, any of these decks that focus on just killing your opponent's characters over and over. Sleepers currently can make a comeback by playing something like Hakim and just repopulating the board, but the problem is they will lose to morale almost immediately afterwards. And the objective here is to make it so that although we're not eliminating Sleeper's weakness to morale, we are trying to make it a little more possible for Sleepers to fulfill the role that I think they ought to fulfill as an anti-board wipe strategy. All right, so let's jump into it. We're going to start off with the commons, and one thing you're going to notice is that I have created a ton of 1-drops, and the reason for that is Sleepers currently only have 4 1-drops relative to other factions that have double or more the number of 1-drops. And it's very important in a game where you gain 1 resource every turn for factions to have a plan on what to do on turn 1. That doesn't mean every deck needs to run 1-drops, but it does mean that every deck should have options in terms of what they want to do on turn 1 to help solidify their strategy. All right, so let's start off with Double Dead, who is a 1 cost, 1 purity, 2 morale undead character, 3/3. And one thing you'll notice is that the format is not the same as the normal Infinity Wars cards, and that's because I'm not a Photoshop master. I don't own Photoshop, so this is made on Paint. And given that I made it on Paint, I think it looks pretty good. So you'll see that the purity is marked by a number rather than a collection of symbols, so it is 1 purity. Anyways, when Double Dead dies, it puts an Endless Horde into your graveyard. And this is a very interesting good Sleepers card because it actually benefits the Endless Horde strategy that I'm trying to push, but it's still a very viable card in any other Sleepers strategy because it presents a body, not an aggressive one. It's kind of like little Timmy bot, but when it dies, it puts an extra thing in your graveyard. It doesn't really necessarily matter that it's Endless Horde because there are so many Sleepers cards that are going to take advantage of that, like Hakim and like Wall of Dead and so many others. So I think this card is a very strong card, and I think it fits the Sleepers theme very well. So let's move on to our second card, which is a very unique piece of removal. Necrotized. It is 1 cost, 2 purity. It is an ability, and it gives a deployed character -4/-4, which will weaken it substantially. Or if its health is 4 or less, it just transforms it into an Endless Horde instead. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about what's so interesting about this card is that, first of all, the -4/-4 can be used to set up your characters that have infect to trade favorably and kill something that they might not otherwise be able to kill. But it also gives Sleepers a fair removal spell because you're paying 1 to swap one of their weak characters for a 4/4 most of the time, which is not nearly as strong as something as Lightning Blast or Flame Dawn Commando, and I don't think it should be, because Sleepers shouldn't have that strong removal. Like I said, Sleepers is proactive, not reactive. But the point of the card is that it helps Sleepers deal with some cards in a way that is fair, like Secluded Constructor and Clore. This card will take care of them very easily. Your opponent gets compensated with a character that is a reasonably effective character, given that in another faction might just outright kill the Secluded Constructor or Clore. And in addition, you can also use Necrotized on your own weak characters to replace them with an Endless Horde. Like I said, if you're using this Endless Horde strategy, this has the potential to buff a character that you have. So overall, I like the card a lot. I will point out one more thing, is that it can only target deployed characters to give your opponent the ability to play around it, so that if they have a Clore in their command zone or a Raziel in their command zone, they can choose not to play those cards and hope that the Necrotize is going to miss. It's a very normal play to make against something like Flame Dawn to dodge the Flame Dawn Commando. And with the addition of this card, it might be something you might do against Sleepers as well. It is 2 Sleepers Purity because I don't want any deck to have access to too much removal. Like, you don't want a Sleepers Varor Flame Dawn deck that has access to all the best 1-cost removal in the game. I think it's best that you limit the amount of removal that any given deck can use. All right, next card we are going to talk about. It's the last of the commons. It is Reviving the Virus. It is 2 Purity, 1 cost. It is a mission card. It is the Sleeper's first mission, and this fits in flavor-wise because the Sleepers, they're eliminated, and this card is supposed to address the fact that the Sleepers can come back. Just to elaborate on that, the whole Sleepers thing is based around the virus, and I think flavor-wise you can have the Sleepers return either because viruses can be latent and rest inside a host until there's a trigger before they manifest their symptoms, or you can have something like this, like in this picture there's like a crypt. You could have the Sleepers be literally sleeping, and that the Overseers think that they have wiped out all the Sleepers, but in fact, some Sleepers have survived underground, and that somebody mistakenly goes in and, digs them up, basically. So what does the card do? Whenever a card is put into your graveyard from anywhere, you create an Endless Horde and shuffle it into your deck, and this card becomes 10% more complete. When it becomes complete, it shuffles an additional 10 more Endless Hordes into your deck. And this card has a few functions. One is that it helps counter the Acquire style mill decks. Another is that it pushes the Endless Horde strategy a little more. Another is that Sleepers have so many self-mill cards, but they're just not really used generally because it feels really bad to just blow up your deck. And this card replaces self-milled cards 1-to-1, so you can feel a little better about self-milling. And then the last thing I want to say is that, and this matters most for Rift Run and / Draft, same thing, is that it allows decks to run an Endless Horde strategy without actually having that many Endless Hordes. So in Constructed, that might mean you're only using 5 actual Endless Hordes, and then you're relying on Reviving the Virus to produce a lot. And it's more important in Rift Run because with so many cards that revolve around Endless Horde that I've created, it's important that people in Rift Run are able to play this strategy, but currently it would be very difficult to get your hands on enough Endless Horde to justify it. But Reviving the Virus over the course of the game can produce up to 10, and it is a common, so it makes it very possible for in draft for you to actually really push that strategy if you're at 2 Sleepers Purity or above. And the reason it is 2 Sleepers Purity is entirely because Rift Run, because I don't think any deck that has only 1 Sleepers Purity ought to be running this card in Rift Run, which is part of the reason why we've done this, so that it doesn't show up in the draft pool for people that aren't going to ever pick the card. All right, that is the last of our commons, and we're going to move on to the uncommons and also the last two 1-drops, because we did create a ton of 1-drops, which I think is justified given how few there were and how important 1-drops are in a card game. So we're looking at Catacombs, and this card is the first one where I'm going to have to bring up specifically that these cards have never been tested before, so there is a chance that some of them might be not balanced, and Catacombs might be the one that is most likely to be unbalanced. So it is a 1-cost, 1 purity artifact. At the end of your turn, it creates an endless horde in your graveyard. Pretty simple. It's an uncommon. So like I said, it's potential there in Rift Run as a card to promote this endless horde strategy, but it's also worth noting that putting any character in your graveyard is good for sleepers, and having a card that just slowly generates characters really captures that theme of proactive but still very slow that Sleepers has. So this card has such a very low immediate impact, but the longer it's out, the more likely it's to affect the actual outcome of the game. So it works very well with Endless Horde, but it also works very well with cards like Wall of the Dead and Hakim. So I think it has definitely a lot of potential, but the reason why I'm concerned that this might be overpowered is because it reminds me of Tinker and Aether Acolyte, which are cards that you have a very low cost investment and a very high cost or a very high impact reward. Catacombs is similar. If you had 3 Endless Horde in your command zone and you played a Catacombs on turn 1, then those Endless Horde could get very big, and it doesn't cost you almost anything. They're just going to get big naturally, which is that's my fear why the card might be too strong. But let me explain, why it is 1 cost instead of something higher is because as soon as you increase the cost even a little bit, you run into some major issues in terms of the card's viability. First of all is that obviously if the card costs more, the investment, so to speak, starts later, which means that it's ultimately going to do a lot less. Like if the card costs 2, you're over the course of the game going to have 1 less Endless Horde in your graveyard, which is a big deal, and you have to spend 1 more resource in addition to that. But it's also worth noting that, like I said, Sleepers have very few 1-drops, but they have an obscene number of 2-drops, like unrealistic. And whenever you have a card that costs 2 for Sleepers, which I don't, because I don't want to populate that slot anymore, there's a huge opportunity cost that is lost in both running the card in your deck and playing it on turn 2. If you played Catacombs on turn 2, which if it costs 2 you would really want to do, you lose the opportunity to play so many other 2-cost cards on that turn, and you lose a ton of tempo. So that's the reason why it costs 1 right now. If this card turned out to be broken, like overpowered, there would be 2 potential changes that I would make to it to address that. One would be make it a unique artifact potentially to just kind of curb the effectiveness of the card in duplicates. But the other thing you could do is instead of having Endless Horde go to your graveyard, you have Sleepers of Avarrach go to your graveyard. And I hope I got the name right. You're going to see the image on the screen. And that card has a very different role with Catacombs if it was created, because obviously when you have Endless Horde in your graveyard, you're making your Endless Hordes more powerful. Whereas if you have Sleepers of Avarrach in the graveyard, then what you're doing instead is the sleepers are growing that are not on the battlefield instead of the ones that are on the battlefield. I think either way, it would be an interesting and playable card. It's just I wanted to force the Endless Horde strategy a little more. But like I said, if this were an actual card that was being designed for the game, it would be play tested and the team would discover whether or not the card needed to be changed or not. All right, now we're looking at our, oh wait, that is not our last uncommon. We're looking at our second uncommon, which is Lifeless Imitation, and our last 1-drop. It costs 1, it's 1 purity, and you look through your opponent's deck and create a copy of a card from it and put it into your graveyard. And the reason why it creates a copy is because if it just straight up put it in the graveyard, then your opponent would no longer be able to use the card. And if they're playing a combo deck that revolves around very specific cards, losing the game on turn 1 because they lose their combo piece, like let's say it was Omnitron. If they lost their Omnitron on turn 1, that would be an extremely toxic game mechanic. That's why this is only going to put a copy in the graveyard. So the purpose of the card is entirely to improve your graveyard resource for the Sleeper's deck. And the card that should immediately come to mind is Bury. And that was intentionally done because Bury is a card that theoretically could promote a reanimator strategy for the Sleepers, where you're ultimately trying to resurrect a huge character very early on. But because Bury caps the card you can search for at the cost of 8, and because the purity for the cards that are actually going to be used to reanimate things for Sleepers are limited, then the problem is that deck, the reason why you don't have reanimator decks now is because there isn't a viable reanimator target for those reanimator decks, and they're just not consistent or viable at lower purities. So Lifeless Imitation is a card that is attempting to make a reanimator deck possible. It also supplements some existing decks as a sideboard card potentially, but the idea is that you could use it against a deck and get their biggest bomb and then resurrect it on turn 5. And I think this is balanced because it means that you can't have 100% consistency because it relies on what your opponent has in their deck. So obviously the card is going to shine most when you're against something like Warpath, but if you're against something like Flameton, the card could really be completely lackluster. But it does promote a new strategy, and I like that a lot. The reason why it is an uncommon is because if it were a common, Bury is also a common, and you would see a lot of these in Rift Run, and you don't want that many of a very similar effect floating around, especially effect that has a very niche use. And the reason it's not a rare is because the kind of deck that wants to use Lifeless Imitation and Constructed really wants to use 3 of them. So I want it to be very much feasible for a player to get their hands on 3 of them pretty easily. And that's all we have to say about this card. So we're going to go on to our last uncommon, which is Colossal Dead. And Colossal Dead is like a giant glorified bloodthirsty dead. He is 6 cost, 6 morale, 1 purity. He is an undead giant, and of course that is because Sleepers have an undead variant of a lot of different kinds of characters in the game, but they don't have a giant yet. And this fills that role. It is a 6/12, so its stats are really, really bad for a 6 cost character, but it has Bloodthirst 6, which means that in combat it's hitting for 12 damage, and it's essentially going to absorb 6 damage per transaction. So against many small characters, like many weaker characters like Flameton, this card really, really shines. But its weakness, of course, is any other big character can actually pretty much just take it out in one go, and it just dies to removal spells. So I don't think it's too strong. It's a card that I think I created mostly to kind of be like a Rift Run card, because right now, if you look at the Sleepers curve, they don't have that many 6 cost cards, and they have no 6 cost characters. So there's just kind of like a weird void there, where most of the characters right now are somewhere between 2 and 4, and then there's a few 5s and 0 6s, and then at 7 you have Hakim again. So we're trying to fill out the curve a little better with the characters, and I think this card does it nicely. It's not particularly flashy, but I think it's very, very, very good at what it does without being overpowered. Okay. Next, we have the rares, and this is where things are getting a little spicy. We have 2 of them. First, we're going to start with the rare that I spoiled on Reddit, and it has changed a little since then because I gave it some thought and it was like, this card is so good, and I thought I'd change it. And like I said before, we're filling out the sleepers curve. There's almost no 7 cost cards for sleepers, so we're adding 1. It is 2 purity because partially because Rift Run, I don't want the Endless Horde strategy to be something that's forced for 1 purity of sleepers. And in addition, I don't think you want this card really in a 1 purity deck in Constructed. I think it should be restricted to higher purity sleepers cards or decks. And what it does, it's scattered bodies, and to fit that theme, it sends bodies everywhere. It creates an Endless Horde in the Assault Zone, Defense Zone, Support Zone, Command Zone, and Graveyard. So this card just generates a massive amount of value at once. It's very similar to Eucalyptus Tree, where it's going to put characters straight up onto the battlefield and can have an immediate impact. And if they live, then you have a even stronger board that you can continue to develop. In the case of Eucalyptus Tree, you develop them by boosting the characters via Enrage, and in the case of this, you've just created for yourself a very large number of Endless Hordes, which are going to grow in power or potentially already at a very strong power level. And this is also a card that, keep in mind, these cards have not been tested, and they have not been tested with each other. This card is the most likely to be impacted by the other cards like Double Dead and Catacombs. Like if Catacombs came out on turn 1, then Scattered Bodies is going to go from being pretty good to completely insane. So when you're playing it, you're essentially getting this is a bare minimum, 2 5/5s out on the battlefield, 1 5/5 in the support zone, 1 5/5 in the command zone, and then the one in the graveyard is what's boosting them to be 5/5s. So it's a very strong card. Maybe it's too strong, but like I said, this would be something that the team would test, and they would really discover whether it was too strong or not. And we already know for a fact that the team does a lot of testing, because if you looked at the changes that happened to the Rebellion cards, like if you went to the Wave 1 preview that I did for Rebellion, those cards have changed a lot, and these cards would potentially change a lot too. All right, now we have our second rare, and this card is filling up the completely empty 9-drop slot for sleepers. Sleepers currently have 0 9-cost cards, and this is a triple purity card because I think it really it embodies the most sleepery of sleeper cards. And it's Disease Breather. So it's an undead character. Its stats are 11-19, which are pretty weak for a 9-cost card, but its effect is worth it, I think. It has Infect, and at the end of every turn that is on the battlefield, it's going to do 2 damage to all deployed enemy characters. So the first turn that he comes out is basically a warning, because he's not coming out straight onto the battlefield unless he's in the command zone. And then from there, he is super dangerous and high priority target because he has the potential to just take so many characters from your opponent at once. Because in case you didn't know, effects that do damage are also affected by Infect. So if this guy kills 3 characters with his ability at the end of the turn, you get those characters under your control. And basically, part of the reason that we want this effect to trigger only on the battlefield, like I said, is to give the enemy player some kind of warning, but also because there's a lot of removal that only targets the battlefield, and I think Disease Breather needs to be very vulnerable when his effect is happening. That if you want to take advantage of his effect, he needs to be out there where he can get killed, either via combat or via a removal spell. Alright, so that's all I have to say about that card. Now we have 2 more cards, which are the Epic and the Legendary. And here is our Epic. And this is a familiar face. This is Yobo, Who Nobody Mourns. So triple purity, and flavor-wise, we already know Yobo, Who Nobody Likes. He is a card that when he dies, he gives you morale because no one likes him. Everyone wanted him dead. And so what happens to him? The sleepers adopt him and still Nobody cares that he's dead. Nobody mourns him. So when he is in your graveyard at the end of the turn, you gain 1 morale. And he himself costs 3. He's a 7/7 with 0 morale cost. And he is a unique character. So although you can have more than 1 in your graveyard, you cannot have more than 1 on the battlefield at once. All right, so this card merits some discussion. First of all, I want to say that it does fit the theme of the Sleeper's long-term investment, but I think it also is going to help kind of take the edge off of a lot of those mill deck strategies that currently I think just kind of annihilate the Sleepers as a whole, even though I do feel that the Sleepers are the one that should have the upper hand in those matchups. I will say that Yobo, who nobody mourns, fits a very unique kind of role compared to other morale gaining cards, because currently almost every morale gaining card in the game removes itself from play after it's been used, and this is to prevent you from recycling them. But Yobo is a card that you don't want to recycle because you want him to be in your graveyard. So that's part of the reason he doesn't have to remove himself. And then in addition, if you keep in mind the overall power level of the card, Yobo, who nobody likes, gives you 10 morale when he dies. Yobo, who nobody mourns, has to be in the graveyard for at least 10 turns to have gained you that much morale. So I don't think the card's unfair remotely. And in addition, it is triple purity, so very, very few decks are going to be taking advantage of this, and the ones that are, I think, deserve that kind of powerful card. I mean, you do have Protector of the Dead for Warpath, which I think is a very similar kind of thing. So there's nothing wrong with having cards that are very powerful against morale, provided that they don't completely shut it down. And I think that Sleepers, even with this card, are still going to be pretty weak to morale. But I think this patches it pretty well. I think it's flavorful, and I think the card is very good. I like it a lot. And now we're going to look at our legendary, and this card is completely bonkers, but I think it is appropriate given that this card is part of the Martyr cycle. So you have Martyr of Death, Martyr of Life, and so on for these other factions, cards that are just ludicrously powerful at the 10 cost. So I created the Sleepers version of this card, Martyr of Plague, and like every other Martyr card, he is 2 purity, 10 cost, 10 morale, and a unique character. He is undead, his stats are terrible, he is a 7/7, and he has Infect, which almost never is going to matter. But you can sacrifice him to transfer all deployed characters into endless hordes. And that is just such a massively powerful effect, because what it's going to do most of the time is your board is going to get dramatically stronger and their board is going to get dramatically weaker. And if you were playing the Endless Horde strategy, that is even more so true. But let's talk about this card a little more, because you may be thinking that this card is overpowered, but I think compared to the other Martyrs, it's pretty reasonable. And in addition, it is a 7/7, so if you're running it in the command zone, it's very, very vulnerable. So generally speaking, it's pretty easy to handle, or it's going to be relatively inconsistent. Admittedly, if you're running it in the command zone, you have the ability to use cards like Awaken to bring it back, but I think when it chalks up to the other Martyrs, it's pretty reasonable. And as a 10 cost card for Sleepers, which is this very slow faction, I think having just such a huge, huge impact is reasonable. And those are all the cards that I have designed, all 10 of them. And I think that I did a pretty good job, but I want to hear what everyone else thinks. Like, which ones of these cards do you think are too strong, and how would you change them? Do you like the cards or not? And until the next video, everyone, peace out.